Hello, everyone. Hi. My name is Krista Dietrich, and I'm a librarian in the Literature and Fiction Department right up there on the third floor here at the Central Library. On behalf of the Los Angeles Public Library, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program. First of all, we would like to recognize and acknowledge the first people of this land and their elders, past and present, as well as their descendants. For information on which Native American territory you may reside on, check out nativeland.ca. We are now starting every program with that native land acknowledgement, so out of curiosity and because it made me I'm curious, I actually went on that website earlier today and put in my address. I'm an OG Valley girl, born in the San Fernando Valley, and I still live there. So it turns out that the land now known as Glendale originally belonged to the Tongva tribe, and one of their sacred sites was the mighty Eagle Rock, for which the city of Eagle Rock is named. So that was kind of fun to find out. And here at LAPL, we love sharing facts and stories with you from all over the world. After tonight's program, please take a look at the reading list that was curated by my department, which will be sent to you by email. I'd also like to make you aware of a few upcoming programs that will be happening here in the taper. The first two are in celebration of Women's History Month. So on Sunday, March 12th, LA Made presents Banda Las Angelinas, I'm going to say this wrong, Sinaloense Banda, made up of women from the city of Los Angeles who will bring us an afternoon full of music in a genre that is usually dominated by men. Then, on Sunday, March 26th, in collaboration with the Irish Repertory and Fish Amble, the library will be hosting authors and writers of color, 4 short plays created by Black Irish authors and other writers of color. Commissioned to address the historic marginalization of artists of color in the Irish canon, the writers spent a year under the mentorship of Obie Award-winning playwright and Pulitzer Prize finalist Dale Orlander Smith. And if tonight inspires you to want to share your own stories, you can always join the Saturday writing group that I host up in Litfic every other Saturday afternoon. For all of these programs and more, please feel free to pick up a copy of our calendar of events on your way out. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Jessica Strand, the Library Foundation of Los Angeles' Director of Public Programming. Enjoy.
Thank you. She's very tall, and I'm short, so I've got to bring it to my size. Yes, I'm Jessica Strand. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Library Foundation. It's really wonderful to see you all here for this exciting program. This is our second Allowed program this year, and we have a very busy season of programming. I think it's starting to annoy people. We are about to add 2 more programs to our schedule in May and June, and so please check out lfla.org/allowed and see more of the programming. There's something for everyone. For those not familiar with the Library Foundation, I do this spiel every time, but if you've heard it, I'm sorry. Of Los Angeles, we are a private, nonprofit organization devoted to fundraising, advocacy, and innovative programming in support of the Los Angeles Public Library. I hope that you will consider joining LFLA to support critical programs like Read Baby Read, Career Online High School, Adult Literacy, and Tech to Go, which gives anyone with a library card the ability to take out a Chromebook and a hotspot, which is a great thing. If joining LFLA is not in your budget, please think about joining, or please join the Los Angeles Public Library. It is free, and there are 73 branches across the city. Tonight, I'm honored to be introducing these 2 wonderful writers who I met actually years ago in New York. Colm Tóibín at the New York Public Library, where I interviewed him about his book, The Testament of Mary, and Rachel Kushner a year or 2 before at the Strand Bookstore, where I started my programming career when she was on a panel for Penn and spoke brilliantly. And I remember thinking, wow, she is really smart. I was a giant fan of both of them then and continue to be, as they both produce varied and fascinating work. Tonight, these 2 friends will discuss Tóibín's latest book, a book of essays entitled A Guest at the Feast. In The Guardian's review of this book, there was a quote that just struck me about these essays. It says, "This country," speaking of England, "that censored the hell out of people's hearts is so much his territory. If the speed with which the power of the church in Ireland has been undermined is still astonishing, it's nevertheless important to consider the hold it may continue to have over those citizens." Tóibín is one who remember when its authority was ironclad. In the end, this book of shadows, tumors and testicles, fog in Venice, expensively clad cardinals who may be up to no good. Colm Tóibín is the author of 10 novels, including The Magician, winner of the Rathbones Folio Prize, The Master, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Brooklyn, winner of the Costa Book Award, The Testament of Mary, and Nora Webster, as well as 2 collections and several books of criticism. He is a laureate for Irish fiction for 2022 to 2024 by the Arts Council of Ireland. Tóibín has been shortlisted 3 times for the Booker Prize. Rachel Kushner is the author of the novels The Mars Room, The Flamethrowers, The Telex from Cuba. Her most recent book, The Hard Crowd, is 20 years of essays on politics, art, and culture. She is a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow and the recipient of the Harold D. Versal Memorial Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She has won the Prix Medicis and has been a finalist for the Booker Prize, the National Book Circle Critics Award, and was twice the finalist for the National Book Award. Please help me in welcoming Rachel Kushner and Colm Tóibín.
You have to turn it on. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Hi, Colm.
Hi, Rachel.
It's Colm with a little breath in there between the L and the M. They have the hardcover of your really wonderful new book of essays. We both have this flimsy advanced review copy, but I was very happy to read this book. I've talked to Colm many times about various books of his or other topics. The first essay, I thought we would maybe start by just hearing you read a little bit of it. I just want to try saying the title for you guys. Cancer, My Part in Its Downfall, is really one of the funniest titles of all time. And the more I think about it, the funnier it gets. I mean, were you being kind of naughty? Do you want to read that little part and then we'll talk about it?
Yeah, just maybe explain that at this time I'm talking about the Pope Francis was in Dublin and the city was cut in 2, which meant if you called an ambulance, it would bring you to a hospital in the south side, but my hospital was on the north side, which meant I would not get through the barrier. They would send the ambulance back to one of the nearer hospitals. The day after my second week of chemotherapy ended, I went back to the hospital. I got an injection in my stomach. It felt like nothing. I looked through the list of possible side effects, but without concentration. The treatment was going to be good. It was going to produce or provoke into being essential white cells. That was a Saturday. A week later, at about 6 in the morning, I was woken by the most excruciating pain in my pelvic area. It felt like something throbbing. With each throb, the pain was more intense until it felt that it could not get worse, and then it did again. And then it died down, only to start again. White cells are made in bone marrow. It felt as though the cells were being produced too fast or were getting ready to crack the bone. I called the hospital and spoke to a nurse. Taking note of what I said, she asked me if I could come to the hospital, if someone could drive me over. I reminded her that the Pope was in Dublin. He would be appearing the next day in the city, which was now divided in 2 for security reasons. A car would not get through. The nurse said she would call me back in 10 minutes. in those 10 minutes, as the pain became so intense that I actually believed that I was going to have a baby, I imagined appealing to the Pope personally to let me through. I would apologize for all the rude things I have said about you. I would take back the assertion that he doesn't mean a word he says. I would withdraw my view that at least we knew where we were with the previous two popes. With Bergoglio, no one knows where they are. I would tell him that I was sorry I had said this, if he would let me through. That kept me busy as the throbbing pain grew more and more unbearable. Finally, the nurse called me back and told me to get the oral morphine I had used before. She told me exactly how much I could take. If the pain was still there in an hour, she said, I was to call back. Is that enough?
There's a part that comes next where then Colm is high as a kite from the morphine and looking at photographs of the three different popes, Francis, Benedict, and John Paul II,
Good.
on the internet, and you think, like, well, that, you know, I mean, people do different things on drugs, but that, you know, knowing you, that this essay originally appeared in the London Review of Books, and before that, I had some sense of, I actually had no sense of what you'd gone through, but I knew that you had gone through something. And the most intimate details about it I learned through reading this essay. And it's also one of the funniest things you've ever written, but the humor and the horror are absolutely inextricably combined. There's a line where Colm says, I was going to beat this cancer by staring straight ahead. Is there a line like that? And then near the end, what will have become, if it has not already, one of the most iconic lines of all time. So this was testicular cancer. And I've noticed that some like book people or like smaller book reviews, stuff online, Amazon, among the things they're really pushing this, they say it's about many things, you know, the popes, Ireland, testicular cancer, but Colm writing about this cancer is really one of the most profound things I've read by a living writer. He says, he's speaking about himself in the third person. It would take him even longer to get used to having only one sad, lonely ball. They used to complete each other's sentences, those balls. They were so close, but now the surviving testicle has to get used to the change. This thing about completing each other's sentences, this could just be me, but people have always said this about Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn. Was that implicit in the joke? So which one is left?
No, they've merged.
I hope it's
they merged
Didion,
enough.
because come on, I mean, if you had to choose one.
Yeah.
Sorry, answer.
I don't know. Philip Roth and Saul Bellow. You know, it's more like that.
So,
Like the Clintons, you know.
but I remember when Joan Didion came to LA, I mean, she was here many times to do author appearances after having lived here, but maybe it was Mona Simpson who said they completed each other's sentences. So as soon as I read that, I thought of them. Now, with these popes, who I've just named, those three, if you had to, and I'm sorry to do this to you, if you had to come up with just one succinct sentence for each, maybe starting with the oldest, you know, with the earliest, John Paul II, and then Ratzinger. I can't help but say Ratzinger, Benedict, and then Francis, Bergoglio. Could you just give like a summary sentence of each one for people who aren't getting high as a kite on morphine and surfing pictures of the popes on the internet?
I think each one proves that you really can't survive your own childhood, and that John Paul II, he came from a Poland that was so under siege from the Soviet Union and from a Catholicism that was under siege, that the idea that anyone then could want to reform that Catholicism, when he was so interested indeed in not just reforming but destroying the Soviet Union, that so when he came to Rome, he simply couldn't see the reformists as being anything other than troublemakers or people who were in a sort of vanguard of people who were attempting the destruction of the church. The same thing is very much true with Ratzinger, that he came out of a very particular Bavaria of the post-war and a very particular study of German philosophy and German theology. And he brought that and some of its uglier aspects. I mean, he could not see homosexual people, for example, as being anything other than homosexual. He couldn't see our humanity. And I consider that to be something that arose from his particular time growing up in Bavaria. The other fellow, the fellow we have now, is Argentine, and he's a Peronist. And the Peronists are very, very good at being both right-wing and left-wing. They're in favor of workers' rights. They will put down a strike. They're nationalistic, but they're not. And no matter what you say to a Peronist, the opposite is also true in relation to human rights, the economy, every single area. So when Bergoglio says, who are we to judge homosexuals, he doesn't really mean that. And so he's very easy to deal with because he's the most slippery of them. The other, especially Ratzinger, was very easy to see where Ratzinger was coming from all the time. The difference, of course, between Bergoglio and Ratzinger is also a difference of style. Bergoglio has very little interest in wearing pink. His shoes don't especially interest him. He doesn't like plush places to live, and he doesn't have a very, very beautiful assistant, which Ratzinger did. I mean, beautiful male assistant.
Georg? Or George? I don't know how you
Gorgeous
pronounce.
Georg, yeah.
Georg, yeah. You mentioned him. So Ratzinger had this beautiful assistant, and the essay in the book about him, The Flutterers, I believe it's called, I have a vague memory that essay had a subtitle when I read it originally, maybe in the London Review of Books, which was The Pope Wears Prada.
Yeah, it was called, on the front page or something, The Pope Wears Prada.
But you clipped that part off for the book.
Somebody did. I don't do those. I'm above all that. But yeah, it was at one stage called The Pope Wears Prada. Yeah.
But this thing about Ratzinger only seeing homosexuals, where you use men as some kind of monolithically that and not complicated full people, but also having this beautiful assistant. There's a lot of, I wouldn't say slippery is maybe the wrong word, but there's a lot of moving around the idea that the Catholic Church is a safe harbor for gay men who seek a religious path. And then also that the Catholic Church is a place where power is wielded in, cruel and unethical ways, and maybe that those, sorry, I don't know anything about the Catholic Church, but those people who are higher up in it, I'm learning about it from reading these essays, some of those who are higher up in the church who are believed to be gay are also those who are most homophobic and most vociferous in their unreconstructed policies about the future of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, under John Paul II, Ratzinger, who was in the Vatican in a very powerful position, came up with a very bright idea, which was to say that it wasn't just that homosexual acts were immoral. We sort of knew that. But that it was being homosexual itself was a moral disorder. So I was at home listening to this, and I suddenly thought, if I decided to spend Saturday nights watching reruns of Bernadette of Lourdes, just say I decided that was what I should do as a homosexual Catholic who was really sorry, and that I should do this, or I should, be on my knees on Saturday night asking the Virgin for help, that I would still be a moral disorder. Now, I took enormous exception to this idea. And when John Paul II died, Ratzinger repeated it. He said it another time. And the problem was that for anyone who was reporting on the Vatican or spending time in the Vatican or talking to people who were in the Vatican, the Vatican was a place really comfortable for homosexuals of many levels. I mean people who were in the closet, people who were open, people who were in between, people who hated themselves, people who loved seminarians, people who were really happy on Saturday night just pestering members of the Swiss Guard. All of those people who were happy gossiping about cardinals, all of those people. I mean, the first real view I got of it was standing one day. I went in behind, I had a press pass or something, and I was in behind in St. Peter's, and all the cardinals had come back from something. And they were all with their assistants, and some of them had pink umbrellas, some of them had yellow umbrellas because it was sunny. They needed, you know, they're all bald heads, and they needed help. And their young seminarians were eagerly holding pink umbrellas, yellow umbrellas. And I just stood watching them all and realized that this is a very complicated place. And part of the complication arises from this, that if you're brought up in a Catholic country as I was, and if you're homosexual as I am, then why would you become a priest of all the things you could do? You know, I mean, you could get a job, you could, you know, go, you know, you could, but a priest. Well, there are very good reasons, and one of them is that, you know, that you could stay in the closet. In other words, people could ask you, instead of, you know, people in the town saying, and you don't have a girlfriend, and you're not married yourself, and as you got older, you get more and more embarrassed about this. They would, if you're a priest, they would never ask you this. So that's one simple reason. But I think a more important reason is that if you were a priest, people would need you and want you. People would want you at the time, for example, to baptize babies, to do weddings, to be there when people were dying. That you would become a sort of necessary member of the community. And that might be a really good reason why. Part of the business of homosexuality is that you probably take nothing for granted, especially aged about 15 and 16, and that you can become quite introspective. That can appear as depression, but it can also just emerge as a sort of spirituality. And that is something that I think a lot of homosexuals who became priests really know about, that feeling age 15 or 16 of particular holiness, of feeling special. And that is why a lot of homosexual men went into the priesthood and really have very fulfilled lives in the priesthood, despite the fact that they're insulted every day by members of the hierarchy. And the rule is, seemingly, if you follow this, is the more the bishop, cardinal, or pope makes statements against homosexuals, the more likely he himself is to be gay. And the more, like Francis is just pretty nonchalant about it. John Paul II didn't bother him. Like no one ever thought that John Paul II was gay. No one thinks Francis is gay. But there are a lot of other fellows wandering around in big palaces wearing pink and, you know, denouncing homosexuals every chance they get. And all you've got to do is just watch them carefully and just see who their chauffeur is, who their secretary is. So I sort of like these little conspiracies. I found the Vatican, anytime I was there, utterly fascinating. I couldn't have enough of the gossip and the talk, and they have a wonderful, wonderful lives there. The food is so good, for example.
Everything you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. You have a line somewhere in one of these essays about this, the introspective young man, and maybe I interpret it to be, you know, it's already so alienating to be a teenager, and then to be a teenager and to be gay is to be marginalized from your society in a way that may put a person closer to God, actually, because you're alone. There's another thing you say connected to that reminded me of something that Italian friends have said to me about actually both being gay and Catholicism, which is that there's a double consciousness to Catholicism. Like Italian friends will say, well, Rachel, you're pointing out a contradiction or a paradox, but what you don't understand is that I'm Catholic. And so I'm trained to hold two opposing ideas in my mind at one time. And you have this line, that you were gay was something you managed to know about yourself and not know at the same time. This is almost an aspect of the Catholic religion, this business of knowing and not knowing something all at the same time, keeping an illusion separate from the truth. Like, telling yourself, as you have been told, that the blood and body of Christ are the real things, but also knowing that it's bread and that it's wine. And you even say that when you were young, you speculated on at what point the bread once ingested ceases to be the body of Christ.
Yeah, I mean, Catholicism really is a mystery, isn't it? That I was watching a nun coming down from Holy Communion, and there she was with the most devout look on her face. And I was going to say to her, "Sister, do you know that you have the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ in your mouth? Like, why do you have it in your mouth?" And so, I mean, the whole idea that you're brought up to believe that at a certain moment, when the priest, who has to be anointed in a very special way, says very special words. It used to be words in Latin, hic est enim corpus meum. When he said those words, hic est enim corpus meum, the literal thing, I was an altar boy, so I could see it. The literal host, little thing, literally and substantially and totally became the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now that is a wonderful idea. I mean, it really is. And Protestants are missing out on that, you know, badly. Not to speak of other particular faiths, or people of none. And the priest believes it, so that, you know, you're going around, as people are taking communion, your job as an altar boy is to hold a thing under, a paten under their chin, in case a tiny bit of the thing should in any way fall, because it mustn't fall on the carpet, because it would be, and you have to bring it back up with little specks on it to give it, so
Could
that,
end
you know,
up in
this
someone's
idea
beard.
of that, I mean, I have to say, thinking about it now, even talking about it now, if you believe that, I'm not going to say if you believe that, you believe anything, but it is unlikely. And the fact that an entire crowd, a massive congregation of people, are bowing their heads, who otherwise are sensible. I mean, it's not as though they're going to go nuts afterwards. They're all going to go back to their shops and back to their jobs and be on time and, you know, have children, do all those things. But for that moment, as the bell rings, hic est enim corpus meum, they bow their heads in wonder that this event has occurred. And I'm a little altar boy watching all of this and thinking, you know, like, so at what point, like, you take it in your mouth, but at what point does it not become the body and blood? You know, so yeah, Catholicism is, it's amazing.
So, like, you came probably by cultural and familial obligation, but you stayed by gossip and spectacle?
Well, yeah. I mean, I love crowds, and if there's ever a crowd, I'll join it to see what's going on, and I like to be right in the middle. So that when John Paul II began to attract, he was made Pope in '79, and when he began to attract these enormous crowds everywhere he went, I became fascinated by what was going on with those crowds and what he was doing with the crowds. I saw him first in Ireland, and I mean, where some of the sermons were quite hard and were very difficult for young people, especially to take, or for women to take, when he was talking about church rules. But and he also got down on his knees, which I thought was a mistake, to ask the IRA to stop their campaign, and they completely ignored him. They got on with what they were doing before. But watching him in Poland and watching him in Rome, realizing that whatever it was he had, it was power. And I watched him with 1 million young people in Czestochowa, and he walked up these steps, because the monastery is on a hill, and they had put the steps right up to it. And he walked up silently with all the lights on him, no hymns, nothing, just silent, just walking up in a sort of straying, wandering way. And when he got to his throne, he put his 2 hands over his face, and he stayed like that in silence. And I mean, he didn't once hector the young people about sex or about anything like that. He talked in a very brilliant way about spirituality. And you could see how inspiring this was in the 1980s. Sorry, this is the early 90s, in a place like, in rural Poland. And so I became interested in what these popes were doing and who they were and what they were, for example, what they were writing. So I began to read. I mean, if the Pope wrote a book, I would probably be alone in reading it. Because they did a lot of very dull books, those men.
So you mentioned at one point in the book of Catholics, we. So you identify. I'm sorry to put this to you, Colm, but I noticed that we. But then you also quote Virginia Woolf saying it's obscene to believe in God.
Yeah, poor old Virginia Woolf. T.S. Eliot came round to her house to say that he really did believe in God, and she just thought, like, that is the silliest thing I've ever heard. And she tried to get him to tell her what he said when he prayed, so she could laugh at him. But obviously he was sensible enough not to divulge this to her. I mean, she was a tremendous atheist, Virginia Woolf.
Did your mother, was she religious, aside from all of the, social, village, familial obligations, the role of the church in one's life, in her private life? Do you think she believed in God?
It's really hard to know what members of the older generation in Ireland felt at the end of their lives. It seemed to me that a lot of the real faith had weakened, and that people were open to the suggestion that there really was nothing.
She started reading literature. She was reading Updike, like dirty stuff.
Yeah, she loved Saul Bellow. I mean, she just found these books on her own. And she loved Saul Bellow. She loved the raunchy bits. And yeah, I was nosing around her bedroom when I was about 10. I'm not sure everyone does this, but I did. And I looked at what was on top of her wardrobe. And there was John Updike's Couples.
That is a dirty book.
And that's one dirty book.
Yeah.
And it was banned in Ireland at the time, so it must have been passed around from woman to woman. I couldn't imagine my father reading it, but my mother and her friends would be fascinated by all this stuff that was going on in your country.
So I felt like I had a sense of your mother from reading your wonderful novel, Nora Webster. I feel like maybe we even did an Aloud event when that book came out. But I learned more reading the title essay of this collection, A Guest at the Feast. And sorry, simple question, but what was the occasion of that essay? Because I wasn't sure. Reading it, it has a wonderful quality. There's so many different parts to it. It's very free and open, and it has a very Proustian quality in trying to kind of capture lost spaces and the story about those two flour mill company houses occupied by aunt and uncle. Just really profound. I love the essay, but tell me what was the occasion?
Some of those pieces were just written late at night when I was on my own, in the same way as you might write a poem, or the same way as you might remember something on Spotify.
The pieces of the essay.
Yes, and go and find. In other words, they're all short pieces, and they're all memory, and they were all. I mean, there are more of them, but these are the ones I thought I wanted to publish together. But they were written on impulse. That was something I wanted to write down to be sure I wouldn't forget. And sometimes I would start them and think, I better finish this because no one else will ever remember this. And so, they're about they were written at the time that the older generation of my family were dying, and things were disappearing, including memories. Houses were being, that whole business of clearing out someone's house. So that was being done, and in a way I was the only one who remembered a whole lot of things.
You say that your mother burned her diaries,
yes.
But you don't say much more about. So why did she do that?
I asked her sister.
She knew you'd been snooping when you were 10 and didn't want you to read them, or?
I asked her sister, why did she burn her diaries? And Harriet said, she said one day that she didn't want you all laughing at her. And I almost said I would have given, but she kept, she tore 5 pages out from one of them. A description of a wonderful holiday in Spain and all the light and all the sunshine.
You have those 5 pages?
I have them somewhere, yeah.
There's another thing another mystery in that essay. You mentioned that Brother Carberry would come to visit her regularly, but you didn't know what they were speaking about. And you don't tell the reader, but I'm assuming that there's some speculative.
I mean, we were all brought up under a group of men called the Christian Brothers. They were not priests, although they had made vows of certainly of celibacy. But they were pretty fierce, and one of them picked on me and put me out of a scholarship class. My mother was a great believer in scholarships. She thought people should, that I had a moral duty to win them, and so being put out of a scholarship class would be a very serious matter. And she decided that I wasn't at fault, although I was, but she decided Brother Carberry was at fault. So she could do this. My father would just go into a corner and hide, because she would go downtown first, and she would get her hair done, a big perm, big heavy perm, and then she would put on really nice clothes and high heels, and she would march down to the monastery. And she would find Brother Carberry. And she would, give big, vivid descriptions of what she did. Like he wanted to put, I remember this vivid, I mean, this is so long ago now, but he wanted to put on the electric fire. He said, I don't need an electric fire. I don't need any fire, thank you. Would you like tea? I don't need any tea, thank you. I mean, Lady Bracknell had arrived, and she would denounce him for putting me out of the scholarship class and say that she would, report him to the principal, and she was having none of this. And I was, and of course, he realized that I was at fault, not him, but she wasn't going to listen to him. But they became friends, which really frightened me. In other words, every so often I'd see Brother Carberry coming up to the house. And again, my father would be elsewhere at the time, and even after my father died, and I'd be looking out the window, oh my God, Brother Carberry, I must have done something much worse than anyone thinks. But no, he was just coming to talk to her, and they'd sit and talk. But I think they sat and talked very politely, that it wasn't even flirtatious. But that would be a very big deal for a Christian brother to visit a woman. And, but she wasn't alone, and there was nothing immoral going on. But it was, I thought, the most curious idea. I wonder what they're talking about in there. My mother and Brother Carberry.
Maybe it's just the potential for a mystery, something a child doesn't know that can be such a generative engine when you're a fiction writer now. There is a long piece in this book that is basically a review of Marilynne Robinson novels. And I found that interesting. It sort of raises this question of the writer's relationship to their living contemporaries. And I think that you review her very thoroughly and responsibly and mindfully. But I also just did wonder, does it come to mind like, I've met Marilynne Robinson a few times. Like, she's very, she's kind of grand and magisterial, and like, I really wouldn't want her coming after me. And I just wonder if that comes up for you when you are reviewing a living contemporary, like, just imagining them reading it. And are you writing to that person? Do you need that person's approval or not? Are you just kind of tussling, and then it'll be in a public sphere? And if they are, of a certain emotional evenness, they'll see all the work that you put into it and be grateful.
I know we're meant to be the same generation, but I feel I'm much, much younger than she is. And I feel that she's very, very
Well,
grand.
I didn't say anything about generation, but that we're all occupying the earth at the same time is what I mean.
I feel she's very, very grand, and that she's a great figure. I admire her enormously. The essay was written, I was trying to just figure out how come just now, when I was going on so much about Updike and Saul Bellow, someone could emerge in America that could actually write very calm novels that are really irrespective of that they seem set in the 50s. They seem set in an America that takes religion for granted, in the part of America we don't read about in many novels, and that she manages a sort of, I suppose, to deal with something that I think is a very difficult matter to deal with as a novelist, which is the small matter of religion. That we don't have in Jane Austen. It isn't as though someone kneels down at night and asks God to give them 10,000 a year. They go to a party, they try and look good, they sort of sound interesting to get someone to, Darcy. It isn't as though in Henry James, Isabel Archer prays at night, or Maisie and what Maisie knew, or that in Washington Square, Catherine Sloper doesn't even invoke God for 1 second, despite the fact that he might. I mean, who can say he could have answered her prayers? So, but that Marilynne Robinson took all this very seriously. I didn't imagine she would read. The piece is very, very long. I didn't imagine she would read it. I understand she didn't read it, but she liked the fact that it was there, which sort of pleased me. And then we had one very funny altercation where we're on a stage together, and I've told a stupid story that I should never have told and I should never tell again. But is that my mother often one drink would be enough just to do it, really, for her to say that, she really, really wished she had been Simone de Beauvoir. And part of the reason for that was she'd love to have had no children. I mean, she loved her children, but it'd be just great not to have had any. And I would, of course, love this and would think, what would she say more about this? And I stupidly told this. I saw Marilynne Robinson, who was like this on the stage, looking at me. I saw us from outer space, and I said to her, Marilynne, have you ever spoken like that to your children? And she grew to her vast, she isn't very tall, but she can seem very large and grand. And she said, I would like to make clear to everyone here that both of my sons are ontologically secure. So that put me in my place for a very long time. And but I mean, the matter still remains that the achievement, especially, I think.
You don't think she was kidding?
No, I think she meant it, that they're ontologically secure. I mean, they know they're alive in the way that I've never been, sure. But anyway, to get back to
I'm
the point,
doubting their ontological security and their mother's kind of arch confidence.
to get back to the point, that I mean, she has written 5 novels. I mean, I know Housekeeping is a bravura piece. It's a piece of wonderful writing, but it is, I think, the second of the 4 novels that are set among the 2 clergymen. It's a novel called Home that I find the most astonishing, because there is a sense in that book that she's dealing with something that no writer has ever properly dealt with since John Milton, which is a small matter of predestination. That if you're a Calvinist, you believe that some people are born to be saved and others are not. Now, what would that look like in a novel if you tried to dramatize it? And of course, she creates this figure of Jack, who's also there in the 4th novel of the series. Jack even asks the other clergymen, is it possible that I am one of the damned? Is it possible that I'm predestined for damnation? Is that what it is that I do? Is that why I cause so much trouble? Is that why I'm drunk so much? Is that why I'm so dishonest? Is that why I've had a baby out of wedlock? Is that why I'm all these things? Because I'm predestined for it. And that is the most astonishing, dramatic idea, that someone in a novel could actually be under God put in that position. Jane Austen never looked at it, but I mean, John Milton does deal with it in poems, and he does deal with it it's to some extent, it's in Paradise Lost to some extent, but no one has really ever taken on that large question that I think it nourishes Calvinism to such an extent. Again, I find it as extraordinary as transubstantiation in Catholicism. The idea that half of us here are destined for damnation and the other half are saved, and there's nothing we can do about this. I mean, it's a bit like Ratzinger and homosexuality. It's a moral disorder, no matter what you do. Those things are interesting for me only if I can find ways of seeing them in fiction. Like predestination in life doesn't interest me. It's what would you do with that if you needed to do that? And I think she has done something extraordinary with it in that novel Home. And I wanted to register that spent a whole summer thinking about nothing else other than that.
It's quite an extensive essay. There's one
It's too
line. No, it's just all really interesting. This is a line, and maybe it's not all high praise in this line, but you say the great hot tap of her biblical prose. It's just too good. The great hot tap. There's another, and then we'll get to audience questions if you have them. But before I'm done with my part, I have to ask you. There's another writer that you write about in this collection, Frances Stewart, who is an Irish writer and somebody who's always been on my radar. Strangely enough, maybe we've talked about this before, but so Frances Stewart, you can say much more about him, but he's a well-known Irish writer who'd written many novels. I only knew him as the translator of a dirty little book by a Frenchman who joined the Charlemagne division of the Waffen-SS in 1944, a guy named Christian de la Mazière, who later was outed when he agreed to be in Marcel Ophil's masterpiece film, The Sorrow and the Pity, and then nobody had known that he'd been a collaborator, and then some. He'd fought against the French in a German uniform, and then Frances Stewart translated his memoir that he wrote about it, which is not a contrite memoir. I did bad things and I see those and want to process them in public. It's much more coded and slippery, and nuanced is the wrong word because it's shady. It's like hiding in plain sight. I was an anti-Semite, then I became a producer, then I dated Juliette Greco. Secretly, I've been an anti-Semite all along, and then very late in life, Christian de la Mazière converted very hard right. And in this essay about Frances Stewart, you're really kind of tussling with his own past. He went to Berlin in 1940, he had a radio program there. And it was just all fascinating to me that, I don't know if you knew that he had translated that book by Lamaziere. I guess, so my question, let me just look at my note real quick, was really, I mean, you make fun in the piece in a way, and I think deservedly, of people who take a very clear moral position, and they're very pious and very accusatory of others, and what they might have done in World War II had they lived through that time, etc. And I think of people like Marguerite Duras, who worked for the Paper Commission for the Vichy and approved whose books got to be published. And there's a lot of people who criticize that, but they didn't live through that time. Her husband was put in Dachau, you know, and came back barely alive. So I always reserve criticism, but with this guy, Francis Stewart, it seems much more complicated, and that you're still kind of struggling in the essay with what position to take and how to think about who he was.
Yeah, I mean, there's no excuse for Francis, but I knew him, and I have to examine how all that happened. I mean, the first thing to be said is that I come from a backwater. In other words, that the Republic of Ireland, or as it was called, the Free State, in 1939 decided no matter what would happen, Ireland would remain neutral in the Second World War. Now, it wasn't fully neutral in the sense that if a British pilot came down in the 26 counties in my country, that pilot was immediately repatriated over the border into Northern Ireland. In other words, was set free. If a German pilot came down, that German pilot was interned for the duration of the war. You know, it wasn't as though at government level there was any support for Hitler, although it might have seemed so, but at other levels. But anyway, I came to university in 1972. The first thing I went to in the first week was introduced by Seamus Heaney. It was the American poet James Tate was reading his work, and he read that famous poem of his called The Lost Pilot, about his father who was a pilot in the war. And then was Francis Stewart, who was about 70 then, and he talked about his novel Blacklist Section H, which had recently been published after 15 years being rejected by every publisher. I went and, first of all, I went to the bar afterwards, and I found myself sitting beside him. And in the conversation, it emerged, maybe I knew, that he was married to Iseult Gahn, and she was the daughter of Maud Gahn, the muse of W.B. Yeats. He wrote, "When you were old and grey and full of sleep and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep." He wrote his great love poems to Maud Gahn. She seemed so far away, Maud Gahn, but she was Francis's mother-in-law. And I said, "Francis, what was she like?" And he said, "Well, she was very beautiful, but she was, as a mother-in-law, she was a total nuisance, you know." She was talking about her as though she was a person rather than a muse. And anyway, I read Blacklist Section H. I was overwhelmed by it in the same way as someone 18 or 19 could be by, say, one of the Beat books, or by William Burroughs, or by, you know, even Salinger. You know, with that sort of takeover of your entire emotional system by a book. It was this rebel who was against everything, and he wanted darkness. He wanted to be Dostoevsky. He wanted to be, you know, in the place where the darkest things were happening, and to be somehow a victim. It's really a crazy book, and I thought it was wonderful. And I eventually got to know him. The book suggests that his anti-hero, H, who's a version of Francis, went to Germany in order to find victimhood, in order to find a place of darkness where he could seek reality through being in the very wrong place at the very wrong time. What emerged later was that Francis was much more openly anti-Semitic in the 20s and 30s. And it wasn't just a nonchalant anti-Semitism, it was an open anti-Semitism, as was indeed his mother-in-law, the muse Maud Gahn, and indeed was his wife. And that Francis he didn't have a problem going to Germany in 1940. He suggests in the novel he drifted in there. He needed a job. And he needed to find where darkness was. It wasn't as metaphysical as that. It was much more that he actually supported the Nazis, at least in the early part of the war. When the war was over, of course, like a lot of people, he realized just that he'd been on the bad side. And he was interned by the Allies. He made his way back to England eventually with his new German wife, who'd also been a collaborator. Eventually made his way back to Ireland, where he just remained very quietly living in the country. until he moved to Dublin, began to publish books again, and became this sort of literary figure, reviewing books all the time, being at literary parties, and a lot of young writers became attracted to him. He would read your novel. He would take an interest in what you were doing. He grew old. He was in his 80s. He loved rabbits. He loved cats. Francis with a cat. Only once did he ever say to me something like, one night saying, Colm, don't you think that democracy is where the scum come to the top? And I said, Francis, no, I don't think that. And, so in other words, eventually he got a great honor from the state. There's a certain honor you can get as a writer. Seamus Heaney got it, and Samuel Beckett got it, and I was awarded to Francis. And of course, some people went ballistic because, the state, because the state had not been involved in the war. I mean, there were not people who lost family, or not many people in the Republic of Ireland who lost family in the Second World War. So that this argument, it seemed to me, was taking place with not enough people involved in the argument. But in any case, the essay is about me trying to tease out how I knew this man, what I thought of this man, how I misread his book, how I learned about him later, what it all means. And it doesn't, I don't know what it means, except I don't think I come out of it very well either. You know, in other words, that I didn't see things clearly. And I'm not sure that's the right thing.
But your doubt is clearly stated in the essay, and the essay did really, for me, it clarified a few things for myself about my own approach to novelists. Not that I've known personally at all, really, but some of my, like Louis Ferdinand Céline is one of my favorite writers, and I also really like Michel Houellebecq. And you think about writers like Céline and Houellebecq, and even some of the kind of Catholic right-wing writers in France who were the sort of the great stylists of the 20th century, like Bernanos, who I think you mentioned somewhere. But maybe with Céline and Houellebecq, I guess reading your essay, I thought, you don't have to defend these people's politics. Or, you know, when it's like Houellebecq's done this kind of shadow boxing, kind of, you know, ducking and dodging all these years, and then just recently, I guess he did this interview where he outed himself as a scoundrel and people were surprised. It's okay to think he's a really interesting stylist and a great novelist and not defend his politics. And when people are slippery and shady, not say, well, we don't have proof that they're an anti-Semite. Just let them cut the size of the rope and maybe hang themselves by it. But the work, for me, is somewhat separate.
Yeah, I just think someone who went to Berlin in 1940, and you can find anti-Semitic statements from before that, and then sought to defend themselves by claiming a sort of innocence afterwards. It's not that you can wriggle out of this. It's a serious question.
Well, the fact that he
and stylists, I don't care what. I mean, stylists are not stylists. In fact, I don't think he was. Francis was a great stylist. But the book hit me at 18 or 19 in that way that I can't just say it was all nothing. And that my friendship with him, I was at his 70th birthday party, I was at his 80th birthday party, I was at his 90th birthday party. And you just think, and I voted for him because I'm a member of the academy.
That's
there.
in the essay, yeah.
I gave him my vote. So I had to look at this because what happened was a young American came to Ireland, and he's a good guy called Brendan Barrington, and he went and found the broadcast. Francis broadcast for Hitler. Brendan went and found the broadcast. And it's filled with that awful stuff, an international conspiracy of financiers. I know what that is. It's called Jews. Like why don't you name it? And that's being broadcast to Ireland, as long with a whole lot of sentimentality about Irishness and stuff. But when I read the broadcast in full with Brendan's introduction, it really made me feel that I wasn't exactly the most intelligent person who'd ever lived, morally intelligent person who'd ever lived. And I thought that was bad. I thought I should examine my conscience,
right.
And I'm a good Catholic and find out my sins and write it all down in a big essay.
You mentioned in it that he had a book that nobody would publish. That I think it was about a novel based on Heidegger, something.
No, it was It was his autobiographical book. It was Blacklist Section H.
No, one that that was the one about Heidegger.
Francis wouldn't really have been a great reader of Heidegger. I mean, he would have loved Heidegger, but he
Okay.
would have not been able to write a book about him. He wasn't a thinker like that.
Okay, I thought maybe it was something I read online and not in your essay. It was something Heideggerian that he'd written that a later publisher wouldn't publish, that got turned down.
A lot of writers wouldn't publish him for various reasons. One, that when he wrote too much, two, he wrote too badly, but the third one was the big one, that he was tainted. Like, once the war was over, his name was a dangerous name. Victor Gollancz, who published him after the war, and Victor Gollancz was Jewish. But eventually had to drop him, not for the obvious reasons to do with that you said. It was just no one was buying those books at that time, and he just couldn't go on with him at that time. Then he was taken up by young Irish writers who edited him and published him. He was a very, very charming man.
I could see that. I mean, his translation of that book is very flowing and beautiful and seductive. But I was really just trying to use the Heidegger thing because I want to share with you my own insight, which I thought about while reading this essay. And maybe everyone's thought of this, but you know, Heidegger with those black notebooks that he didn't destroy. Unlike your mother and her diaries, he left them. And as I was reading this, I understood suddenly why he left them. Because it's been one of the great mysteries. Why did Heidegger stain his own name by leaving those diaries? He was convinced he was right, and he wanted to have the last word. Final simple question for you, and then audience. So this is a list of all your publications.
I know.
What are you going to do when it runs off the page?
I don't know. I look at it regularly. I wake each morning and I look at that long list.
It's going to come...
And I think, how could you, like, can they put it on a second page? And also, how did all this happen? When did it happen? And it seemed to me as if it occurred suddenly. You know, it looks gradual, book by book by book, but it was only suddenly that I noticed it. And it looks like someone else has been at work quite hard, and I have been enjoying myself. But as I say, every morning I have to remember. And it looks like it looks like a tombstone. You know, in other words, it looks like it's just there's not much room left. You know, it looks like the entire. You know, a tombstone with all the family is mentioned, but poor Annie Jo is still alive, and saying, "Where's my name going to go on the family tombstone?" Well, same to me. It's where my next book. There's no room for any more, so it'll have to end soon.
They'll just shrink it, and then it'll come with one of those magnifying glasses, like my condensed Oxford English Dictionary.
But thanks for raising it. I mean, it's very nice of you to bring the matter up.
Are there questions? I think we have time for a few. And Tiffany's going to moderate, I think.
Yeah, we're going right down in front. I found that personally Ireland, particularly Dublin, changed dramatically in the 70s and then the 80s and the 90s. And I was wondering if you care to say, as a Catholic gay man and an artist, how do you feel the opening up of things and the changes impacted your ability to grow and evolve?
It's a curious business how that happened. Dublin was always, had always, around the universities and around even the visual artists, there were a lot of independent-minded people. There was a resistance to the church, which made life pretty interesting. In other words, there were certain pubs you could go into. There wouldn't be a Catholic. I mean, everybody would mock everything. You know, and this was when I came to Dublin in '72. But that began to become official, that attitude, with the help of someone like Mary Robinson, who eventually was elected president in 1990, but she was a civil rights lawyer up to then. So she's the one who, for example, who got through that women could sit on juries, which they couldn't do until sometime in the 70s. And she got like the contraceptive thing through in the 70s, which again couldn't. So those things happened gradually. Some things happened for example, when we joined the European Union in 1973, they just said, stop, there's not equal pay for women in the public service. Like that is just, you can't do that under the European Union. The Irish government said, we can't afford to pay women the same as men. And luckily Brussels said to them, well, stop it then, just afford it, now, today, change that. And those arguments, we won every argument. It seemed we lost some of them in the 80s with abortion. And the Irish abortion one, I mean, it was put into the Constitution. It was a constitutional referendum. Trying to get it out of the Constitution, repeal the 8th, looked like an impossible task until suddenly it just enough women just were so enraged by it, and the numbers going to England to have abortions were that it just wasn't sustainable anymore, and so a democratic movement began from ordinary people upwards to say this has to go out of the Constitution, and it did. And the same thing happened with the gay referendum. I mean, the gay referendum was even the gay marriage referendum, which had to be a constitutional referendum. And that was even funnier because it was run by brilliant people, and they just advised all of us, people like me, shut up for 3 weeks. Don't speak. And, meaning that we don't need strident people like you. We need your mother. We need your sister. In Ireland, a lot of election work is done door to door. If you're going to a door and you're gay, don't speak. Bring your grandmother. Bring your brother. Your brother says, this is my brother, and he's gay, and we love him, and he's in our family. I got married last year. We'd love to go to his wedding. Would you just give us your vote so we could just make him equal to us? And so it became this soft movement. It was the least angry thing you could do. I did one radio thing where, they just said to me, just sounds sad. I said, okay. So I was on with someone from the opposite side, and I said, what have I ever done to you that you would feel that I am not to be included as an equal person, that my love is not to be represented in Ireland as yours is? Oh, the other person nearly died because he was expecting to have a big shouting match with me. And I just grew this really sad homosexual who was just having a miserable time because I wasn't married. So, some of it has been very, very funny, has been using, what we did was we took the word love back from the church, and we took all the word marriage back from the church, and we said, we want them too. We think settling down in the suburbs with a dog is all we want, to be really, and we'd be nice to our neighbors and stuff. And, we won't, all the things you think we do, we don't do. And so some of it has been very funny, and most of it has been very effective.
Any other questions? Yes.
Good Catholic. So you mentioned good Catholic, which growing up, that always had kind of a lot of meanings in a Catholic family. And it was kind of stinging sometimes when people would, I guess, question I didn't understand it. How do you define or use that expression?
Which expression?
Good Catholic, quote unquote, good Catholic.
Oh, well, I remember when they abolished limbo. Does anyone remember that? 1 year. They just couldn't hold on to their own things. 1 year there was limbo. With babies born who didn't just get to be baptized, went to limbo. And there was going to be no end to their time. It wasn't like purgatory, where you would go on to heaven eventually. Limbo was just where you stayed, and it was grey. It was a grey place. And the priest said that the big business of limbo was that the thing you would miss most, boys, the things you would miss most in limbo is the sight of God. You would never get the sight of God. We all looked at the priest and nodded. That would be an awful thing to not get the sight of God. And the next year it was gone. And the one that really, I think, ended the whole business was confession. Now, I know why confession ended. It's confession because priests grew really tired of sitting for hours and hours hearing good Catholics just say, I forgot my night prayers, or, I forgot, and hour after hour of it. And they just said they couldn't bear it anymore. And, you can imagine your Saturday night. Their Saturday night would be from about 6 o'clock onwards. People whispering their sins to you, and you're having to tell them, and sins would generally be of no interest much, and so slowly they began to eat away at their own, and then it became very, very hard to be a good Catholic in the countries like this country, Canada, Australia, Ireland especially, when the whole story of pedophile priests emerged, and the fact that the people who were preaching to you about how you should live and what you should do were in fact fondling children in their spare time, that the idea of it really reduced their power significantly in countries that up to then had been what I call Catholic countries. So the pandemic has not helped either, because the churches in Ireland are empty. They're appealing to people who were 1 minute bossing us all around. The next minute they're appealing to people just to come back, even just once on a Sunday. So it became very hard to be a good Catholic in certain societies in the 1990s. Oh, now I don't know. Now it's really hard to say because it would have. I mean, there's a there's a comedy show in England. I don't know if you've seen it here called Fleabag. Well, there's a character in Fleabag called Hot Priest, and he's there because there's no such thing in London as a hot heterosexual priest. I mean, there's no priest of that generation. We just don't, those of us of that, I mean, people of that generation just didn't go to become priests, and no one younger did either. So priests are literally dying out, and I mean, so she made a hot priest because it's the very single thing that isn't in London, a hot priest, and that's why it's so funny. But I don't know the answer to that because it's become a generational thing that anyone who's a good Catholic who's say in their 20s or 30s, there's something slightly creepy about that now. No, really. I mean, that's what they've done. And whereas older people maybe can be good Catholics, but I think that's something. It's like hot priest, good Catholic. It's sort of just shifted its ground a good bit, you know. Yeah, hot priest, good Catholic. I hadn't thought of that.
That was a great answer.
We have time for one more.
One more question? Oh, I'll let the moderator choose. I can't take that power. Two more. Okay.
Take this off so you can hear me. Do you think that maybe being a good Catholic would depend on where you see the church going? If you're a Dorothy Day Catholic, if you're a Catholic worker Catholic, if you're a, I don't know, Saint, who was it? Mother Teresa Catholic. There's so many Catholics that I have met who are working for immigration rights and refugees and Catholic children. So many of them are women who are nuns. There's a whole women priests movement. So I'm wondering if you're the Catholic of Pope Benedict Ratzinger, if that's very different than if you're, serving food a few blocks from here 3 times a week, if you're opening your home to homeless people. So when you look at that good Catholic, do you think that maybe we're talking about many different ways to be Catholic? Maybe there are several different Catholic churches?
I think that's a great question. That time I'm talking about in Częstochowa in Poland, it was the early 90s. There was a moment where all journalists were told to be at a certain place for a very important press conference. And honestly, I was foolish enough to think, is it possible that John Paul II, all along, like Gorbachev, like de Klerk in South Africa, has been pretending to be a proper member of the hierarchy, but all along has plans for reform, and those reform. If simply he had said that day, there are going to be women priests, for example, or priests are going to be allowed to marry. Just those 2 things could have started with, and the church is going to be a mission to the poor, for example. If he had said that, then everything would have changed, and what happened over the next 2 or 3 decades would have been different. Instead, we were all gathered together, herded together to be told that Danuta, the wife of Lech Walesa, it was a rumor that she had spent a night in the monastery. And they wanted to assure that no woman since medieval times, when the monastery was built, had ever spent a night in that Polish monastery. And could all journalists write that down and report it? And I just remember thinking, at the top, this doesn't look good. This isn't going to end well, this story. But you're absolutely right, especially in America, that the church has many mansions now. But God, I remember that day just shaking my head going down the hill thinking, they don't know what is coming if they think that's an important piece of news. Danuta, the wife of Lech Walesa, slept elsewhere that night. God bless her.
Final question.
Hold on.
What inspired you to write The Testament of Mary?
What inspired me to write The Testament of Mary? I was having a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about the idea of the lost Greek plays. The fact that we have some, we have Medea, Electra, Antigone, but there's so many more we don't have. And I then just casually said, of course, there is one but we don't treat it as such, which is effectively the New Testament. And he said, he was a producer in the theatre. He said to me, would you write that as a play, that story? And then he wrote to me, and then I began to think about it, and I began to read about it. I spent a lot of time with St. John's Gospel. One translation saying that St. John had seen Greek theatre in Ephesus, that he was in Ephesus at the particular time when he could have seen Medea, he could have seen Electra, he could have seen Antigone. He could have seen that idea of powerlessness, becoming power once it's in speech. That in other words, the men in those plays spoke like legislation, but the women who were meant to be powerless had this wonderful eloquence, especially when they were under pressure. And it struck me, what if Mary spoke? What if she, as an old woman with nothing to lose, spoke once? What would that sound like? And so once the thought came into my head, it came in images then, and then it came in rhythms, and then it came in words. And so I wrote it down. That's how it happened. The idea that out of silence, if speech comes out of silence, it comes with a particular texture, with a particular sort of intensity and sense of relentlessness in how it might sound. And so then it was written, and there was nothing I could do then, because as Rachel will know, once you write something like that, there's no chance you won't publish it, and then it was just to finish. It was on first in the theatre in Ireland. We were talking about change in Ireland, and we were all ready for walkouts, for protests, for horror. The Virgin Mary gets to speak, and she says a whole lot of things that are not part of the liturgy. And so, in that time in Dublin, no one walked out. No one at any moment walked out, and no one had any protest to make. The only protest was the small one, that a very serious moral theologian, a priest, came to one of the preview nights. And Dublin is small, and I know him, and as I was going up the aisle, I saw him, and I said to him, what are you doing here? And he said to me, I just want to see what you're doing, just want to see what's going on. And on the way out, he tried to get by me, but I stood there. And I said, and he said, oh, I loved it. I really loved it. I said, really? And he said, yes. You see, my hearing is more or less gone, so I couldn't hear it, but it looked lovely. And then he walked by me, meaning if you think I'm going to denounce your play, like, we don't do that anymore. So there was a sort of sly dance going on about Ireland has changed. The chances to get denounced by a priest or a clergy now are sort of zero. They know not to do that now.
But I saw the play in New York City starring the incredible actor Fiona Shaw, and I think that there were protests outside.
Oh, yeah, but they came up on a bus from Pennsylvania. And no, I've nothing against people coming on a bus from Pennsylvania, but they hadn't seen the play. And one guy, because I went over and decided to ask them, like, what's going on here? And they said to me, oh, there's a movie being shown, one guy said to me, but also they didn't come into the theatre and they didn't disrupt it. But they did make a bit big of a fuss outside. It looked good on film, but there weren't that many of them. Mm-hmm.
The play is extraordinary. It really captures something that I'd never thought about in terms of just the sheer terror of Mary having made this child who then is going to totally change and even disfigure the former order of the world. It's such a profound piece of writing. I recommend people read it. And also there's a wonderful audiobook read by Meryl Streep, so you can't go wrong with that. I think we've gone way over. Thank you so much, Colm.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you. Colm will be signing books in the lobby after, so get the book we've been talking about and get him to sign it. And join us next Thursday with Colm Campbell and ICAR's Rabbi Sharon Brous. Thank you. Thank you for being here.